Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about sanding blocks. Today we're going to talk about all the different variations of sanding blocks. I get a lot of questions on, should I buy big kid blocks? Should I buy Lucky Blocks, Alumacraft, True Blocks, all the different variations. And the truth of the matter is, they all work pretty dang good. It's just personal preference. Today we want to talk about the different variations of what is different about each manufacturer, and we also want to talk about how to pick the correct block for the particular project that you are working on, because every car is going to change drastically, and everything that you can do with the different kits, with the exception of some of the more flimsy blocks like Dura-Blocks, which are ultimately probably the most comfy block you can buy, but it's not going to give you the straightest finish. So we use the Dura-Block a lot to rough in our bodywork, and then we do all of our finishing sanding with an acrylic block or an aluminum block. So I wanted to start out with the straightest block and kind of work our way through, and then we're going to talk about how you pick that block per vehicle on selecting why and how on each one. Now, this block is a completely machined and bolted together with the handle from Alumacraft blocks. And these things are really, they don't get any straighter than this. There is no deflection in the block itself, and they even fly cut with a Bridgeport to get this perfect finish on them. But the thing of it is, there's very few cars that are perfectly flat. Almost all of them have a radius somewhere in that panel. Everything is not a complete shoebox. So, but on the other note, you have a company like Lucky Blocks that makes a block very similar, being that it's 3/4 of an inch thick. It does have a little bit of deflection, which is usually pretty good. You can see you get some deflection, but not very much. And it's kind of nice because this is really what we started with, was Lucky Blocks when we started picking acrylic blocks, because I liked the handle. And it's kind of nice because you can move your hand and change direction easily. You're not having to be fixated on one particular spot where you have an obstruction in the handle. So that part of it's kind of nice as well. And then we step into big kid blocks, where you have a variety of so many different kinds of things that you could use to do the same thing. Notice on an aluminum block, even though it's only 1/4 inch thick, there is no deflection because of the structure that it has to it. Where you have no structure, you just have an acrylic 3/4 inch block on a Lucky Block, so you're a little bit thicker, so you have less deflection. And then you have something where it's a lightsaver as far as having a 1/4 inch, but with having a backing for that rigidity. There is no flex in this big kid block at all, and it is kind of nice because you have a handle that you can go anywhere to. But know that you won't have any kind of deflection, so this is only for your perfectly flat panels. Maybe you're just working in between the wheel well area. That's a good one. And then you have something like the also big kid block. These are called the money makers. And in the money makers, this is even thinner than a 1/4 inch. It's lighter than, say, the blue block. However, it does have a backing for that rigidity. So these are kind of cool because I probably use these the most out of everything when it comes to straight panels, because they're so light and everything is a touch. The big misconception on all these different brands is that people think if I buy Alumacraft or I buy big kid blocks, it's going to get the perfect finish right out of the box. And it's actually all technique. It's all in how you use those blocks. You can get pretty much the same finish. Maybe one has an advantage over the other, but variety is the spice of life that makes this work. Everything from if you're doing a small area to a big area. Does it have a curve? Does it have a molding? Maybe it's a 30s Ford or a 40 Ford with big curved fenders, and we want to go through and talk about what that is. Also something to think about when you're trying to do flat panels. You have these blocks that they're heavy. This is extremely heavy and you're gonna get an arm workout, but maybe you're working downward on a roof or a hood and that heaviness is gonna help you in sanding your body filler. The number one block I would say that I honestly probably use for really big areas, roughing it in, is I really like the heavy hitter from Big Kid Blocks. I like it because a lot of times I'm just using one hand to guide and one hand to push, so it's super comfortable, and I like that this has just enough deflection that as long as you're going light with it, you're still gonna get that straight finish. But like I said, all of these blocks are serving pretty close to the same function, but you're talking about a comfort and a weight. Whatever works for you is really what's the best. So we like to have all of them. One block that we just started getting into was the True Blocks, which are down here. It's ultimately almost the same as the Lucky Blocks, except for the handle is thicker, it's heavier duty. I feel like these are probably gonna last longer, but they do have the same deflection dependent on how thick the block is, and they sell every thickness you could possibly think of. So all of these have a really good advantage. Notice these have chamfered edges. Maybe you're trying to work into a tight area where you need to get into a corner, and that's why you would use something like that. So it's nice to have these different little things to be able to get in tight areas. Also, they have little tiny detail blocks. These are from Big Kid Blocks. I'm demonstrating these because we have a lot of these blocks. But the cool part about these is they're super rigid. A lot of these are for detailed areas, like I was saying before, where you're trying to get into an area that's tight. Maybe you have a molding, and this just kind of finishes off your bodywork. We have the Dura-Block that you can find almost anywhere, whether it be a local auto parts store. But the biggest thing with these is you can push on them and they deflect, they give, they bend really easy. So it is good for roughing everything in, but when it comes to the finish work, unless, and even then, you can get a pretty good finish with a Dura-Block, to be honest. It's all in the touch. Sometimes you have to make blocks. We just used a steel rod that we wrap the sandpaper in, and then we feather out curvatures maybe in a body line. So there's a variation of different things. This Dura-Block has a very odd shape. Maybe you use it to work into a tight to get area. And then ultimately, once you pick your block, which we're gonna get into next, it's, like I said, all of these are strictly a comfort for each person. Everybody has their different preferences. It's kind of like Ford or Chevy. Everybody has their reasons why they like one or the other. One thing I would like to add is we don't use any hook and loop or Velcro sanding paper. Everything has to be the sticky back, because when we're talking about deflection, if you have that thin layer of the Velcro where you're sticking it to your block, that's allowing you to have ripples. You need something that has a completely flat surface for that curvature. We'll notice that we do have these soft blocks. I think I got these from Eastwood or somebody. These things are super flexible. We don't use these really for any fine tuning of things. This is kind of just to get in a really smooth curvature, and maybe your panels are already really close and you're just trying to blend something out. These work really good for finessing those body lines out and smoothing everything. So when you get into wet sanding, you got the soft blocks, which these seem to become harder and harder to find these days. They do sell them in a little bit thicker block, but these are typically what you would use for wet sanding. And even then, the wet sanding stages, when it comes to blocking out a car, these blocks, I believe I got these from Lucky Blocks as well. They have these in a variations of different thicknesses. So obviously the thinner, the more that it will flex. Same thing goes for as you're starting to pick the block for that panel. This one being 1/4 inch has a good flex. The biggest thing you want to do when selecting a block, I'll show you here on the Pantera. So you want to do what I call the thumb test. That's just what I teach in our classes. If you can put a block on the vehicle and take your thumbs at either end and just give it a slight push, you want the thickest block that you can use for that curvature that you do not have to push hard for. And I talk about finesse. Finesse is how you block, how far you go into the panel. And when it comes to doing the flats, you always want to start in the center of your car, typically between the wheel wells, and work that main area completely flat first. That's going to ensure that everything is starting off of that flat point. That's what your eye is going to go to initially when you go to a car show. It's going to see the biggest, flattest area that shows the best reflection. So we would body work this entire panel all the way into these inner radiuses before they hit the fender flares. And once we get this completely flat, we will then work into picking the next block. When you pick those blocks, we'll go, I usually downgrade. I'm going to use these as an example. Notice how much more this flexes. It's a 1/4 inch block. We'll do it here on this fender. When you're trying to block this fender, I'm pushing, but I'm pushing a little too hard, meaning the center of the block is going to wear way more than this outer edge of the block. You want something that you can easily push over the fender and still create the same shape. So if this is flat all the way to here, we want to work this curvature using a block that we feel the most comfortable with. Now, because this block is too thick, or maybe I don't like the way the handles are positioned, you could go to something like a Lucky Block or a True Block. And this one is also a 1/4 inch, so it's probably going to have the same. It does flex a little bit more, but notice it's still just not quite fitting it. It's also too long for this demonstration. But you want to pick, this is like a 1/16. Notice how much this thing bends and how easy. You might use this on, say, a big 40 Ford fender where you have a nice, good radius for the whole thing and work that back and forth lightly. But it's very rare that we use these this flimsy of a block. So you just want to go through and pick. So I would pick the next thinner one of this block, which I don't actually have up here, to be able to create that curvature when you're body working into it. The biggest thing you need to know is if you already have the center area flat, you want to make sure you're not digging a hole from this fender flare into your flat and creating waves in your panel. It's all a light touch. Every bit of your body work should be, I mean, typically when we do body work, we're only using 2 fingers on each hand and blocking the panel out. You have that window when the body filler is still in the soft stage that we will start blocking it out. You don't necessarily want to wait till that body filler is completely hard. It's like sanding concrete. And nobody likes body work the majority of the time because they think it's hard work and it's hard to sand. So that's why you want to do that window of opportunity. You will also notice that we do put body filler in between your quarter panel and your door, so that way you're ensuring all the way panel to panel you have the exact same mill thicknesses and that you've corrected the sweep of the car to create one shape from headlight to taillight. So make sure you have everything locked in place. You've already test fitted the door, you have all your gaps done, your metal finishing is done. Another thing you want to make sure of is that your door or quarter panel isn't oil canning. If you have oil canning, you have a panel that is overly stretched, and even though it's welded on either end, it's bound. So if you put it in the sun, maybe you finished your body work inside your shop and it looks perfect that day, and maybe the next day you put it out in the sun and you're noticing that it has waves in it. Well, that's because expansion and contraction of that panel, if it's bound and it's too stretched, it's got to go somewhere. So you might have more of a wave in a car in the sun versus in the shade inside your shop. So be aware to make sure you do a lot of your research in metal finish, which we are going to do in our how-to videos. Everything from shrinking disc, hammer and dolly, to planishing hammers. We're going to be covering all these different things. So make sure as we go through these projects, you tune in weekly and see what kind of how-to update we have and on what project. It could be the 55 Chevy or the 64 Malibu. But that is kind of the rough overview on picking the blocks. I honestly would not say that we have one set of blocks that I like more than the other. We use them all pretty regularly. When you are blocking, you want to make sure that you use guide coat to be able to show where your highs and your lows are all the way through wet sanding. We use this carborundum dry guide coat because that's who our distributor sells, but I have heard a lot of good things about Mirka. I know we can't get this in white, where Mirka you can actually get this in white. So say you had a dark color like black that you're wet sanding, you could actually use the white dry guide coat in between every single stage of sanding that you do to be able to ensure you're making sure all of those sand scratches are completely eliminated. And then you have the spray can aerosol guide coat. This is also really good because if you have an area like a door jamb, you want to ensure that you've scuffed every single part of that car from edge to edge, whether it be underneath or not. So I always put this in the hard to get areas to make sure that you hold yourself true, that you think you wet sanded it. This makes sure you sand that thing until it's completely cleaned up with no more guide coat on it. There is a lot of different stages as far as sandpapers go. We start with 80 grit in our body filler stage, and we work up to, you could use 100, 120. My particular preference is we go from 80 to 150, and from there you're really dialing it in. I like to look at it as you're using body filler in your 80 and up to 150 grit stage, and pretty much after that your body work should be complete. At that point you jump to 220, and really all you're looking for is getting rid of sand scratches. So everything from 220 up, and like I said, this isn't the only way, this is just my personal preference on what we do in this shop. 220 and above is just removing scratches. All the way from 220, we jump to 600, and then we go into wet sanding. We're going to talk about all these different processes as we go, but this is kind of to help get your DIY guy that's in your garage started on what block do you buy and why. Do you like handles? Sometimes it's good to just buy one block, two block, maybe a small starter kit from each manufacturer. You're going to use them. It's just a matter of when and on what car. They all serve their purpose. So have a good variety. There is no one-stop shop. This block does everything. That doesn't really exist in my opinion. So try them all out. They all work really good. Like I said, if you're trying to do a show car, Dura-Block's not going to get you to a show car finish, but an acrylic block or an aluminum block will. Even if it's handmade out of an epoxy, make whatever it is you need to fill that curvature. So with that, I'm going to wrap this video up. Hit the subscribe button, like the video if you like the content, and thanks for watching.